Next on Newsmax Prime.
It's time to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
Washington was built on wetlands after all, but gators don't lurk in that D.C. swamp. Elephants, donkeys, and bureaucrats do. How tough a water hazard will this prove for the president-elect? Then, constructing a cabinet. The comings and goings continue. Who will end up staying? Plus, politics is theater, or theater's politics. The Hamilton harangue directed at the vice president-elect, a form of bullying on Broadway? All that and more as Newsmax Prime starts right now. Good evening and welcome to the Monday night edition of Newsmax Prime. I'm J.D. Hayworth. Of prime interest tonight, Trump's tough task. Can the next president succeed where some of his predecessors could not? The way I see it, we need to look back before we look ahead. You may recall that Ronald Reagan hoped to abolish both the Departments of Education and Energy in the early 1980s. Of course, President Reagan remained in office for two very successful terms, but he was unsuccessful in his efforts to close those two departments. Both Education and Energy remain open to this day. In the mid-1990s, it was my honor to serve in the first GOP House majority in 40 years, and many of us took aim at killing the Commerce Department. Of course, President Clinton, who famously proclaimed the era of big government is over in response to us Republicans controlling Capitol Hill, wasn't really interested in having his deeds match his words, so the Department of Commerce never closed. Now, as history prepares to open the curtain on the Trump administration, cynicism abounds when it comes to reducing the size of government. My advice, no bold pronouncements about closing government departments. Instead, institute a government-wide hiring freeze on non-defense related jobs, roll back all that excessive regulation, and present budget plans that don't just slow the rate of the increase in government spending, instead actually cut spending. With the staggering deficits we face, we have no choice. Spending must be reduced for our republic to survive. And that's the way I see it. My Newsmax colleague Ed Berliner sees it a bit differently. As he compares the rhetoric of the campaign with the reality of governing, Ed says one of Mr. Trump's promised reforms may simply remain a promise.
Clearly, Mr. Trump is not a politician, and I think America has spoke. They don't want a politician.
It all sounds so wonderfully easy, tossing out those creatures with thick hides from years of navigating the dark side of American politics and bringing to the fore those who have fresh ideas and have not been compromised by the usual politics.
That is I said that about a week ago. And I didn't like it that much. Didn't sound that great. And the whole world picked it up. So it shows you what I know. It's crazy. Drain the swamp. We're going to drain the swamp of Washington. We're going to have fun doing it. We're all doing it together.
Hang on. It's not so simple to select people for a position of power who would not be considered to have already lived and prospered in that very swamp. Michael Flynn brings a distinguished military career to his job as National Security Advisor. 33 years in the military, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, someone who certainly has navigated the swampy depths of D.C. For his proposed Attorney General, Donald Trump has chosen Senator Jeff Sessions, a member of the Senate swamp for 20 years. He does have the legal chops for the job, having begun his public service life in '81 as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Alabama. The proposed CIA director, Mike Pompeo, is indeed one of the newer faces, having first been elected to Congress in 2010 after a life in private business. However, his resume shows no experience dealing with the covert operations side of national security. This is Washington, D.C. Those who will succeed have been in this swamp before and better know where the mud is deepest, because the opposition has those avenues just as well plotted. And when one seeks real change, the rules are simple.
For those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted.
As deep as political power and influence runs in Washington, D.C., it would border on the stunningly foolish to place into a position of authority those who do not know nor understand the landscape. Thus, you can drain the swamp. It's been tried before, but masters of the muck have survived and can only be defeated by those who know how to survive in the political wild. J.D., it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Ed. To talk about all this, I'm pleased to be joined here on the anchor desk by our Newsmax TV colleague, John Bogman, and via telephone from Los Angeles. We have standing by the political commentator and son of President Ronald Reagan, Michael Reagan. Of course, Michael, the author of the book, Lessons My Father Taught Me. And as always, you can find and follow Michael Reagan on Twitter at Reagan World. So, Michael, we took a little stroll down memory lane with history. Obviously, your dad wanted to get things done with a Democrat Congress. The Democrat Congress did not want to reduce the size of government. Conversely, when I was in the Congress, Bill Clinton wasn't really interested in closing down any department. But now the government is united. Any chance we're going to see meaningful cutbacks during this Trump administration?
Well, I think we'll see meaningful cutbacks. I think exactly what you were talking about, in your opening. Whether we're going to close down the Commerce Department or Department of Energy or the Education Department is something else. And again, those are very tough to close down. Why? Because now they've created thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs, not only in Washington, D.C., but across the United States of America. So it's best to cut back on your hiring, have a hiring freeze, and move forward and fight the battles you can win. Don't start fighting battles you can't.
John Bogman, we take a look at this, and you really look at the size of the bureaucracy. Michael mentioned it. Those bureaucrats have union protections.
Yes.
I mean, when you've got a grievance...
President Kennedy.
That's right, the executive order he signed in 1963. If you start the grievance process against a member of those unions, it can take 6 years, the length of a Senate term, to remove somebody.
And Michael's right. I mean, you have to put some W's up on the board and score some wins first, but you can count me among those who are perhaps a little cynical about the government's ability to cut their own paychecks, their own salary. We have this enormous bureaucracy, JD, as you mentioned, and on top of that, we've seen numerous regulations added over the last 8 years that do desperately need to be untangled from our government. But you have a guy now in the White House who is a Republican based on his party, but through his history has not exactly supported conservative ideals that would shrink the actual government. So I am skeptical as to whether or not these guys can actually shrink the government. I do hear all the right things coming in terms of draining the swamp, but I'll stand back and wait to see the results.
Well, that's why we're here to keep an eye. Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead, sir.
I jump in. John makes a very good point, and I tweeted this a long time ago at Reagan World. That what you have with Donald Trump is you have an independent who ran as a Republican. And that might well be what this country needs at this point, having someone who's not really with either party, but an independent tied to a Republican Party.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that has to happen, Michael and John, and John mentioned it, small wins along the way. And one way we gauge that now is the transition. Now, last week, we heard such a big stink about all the transitions in disarray. It's moving slowly. It's only been a week. Kellyanne Conway, great Republican pollster, and now perhaps, when you take a look at what happened, the first woman to manage a presidential campaign, helping lead Donald Trump to victory. Here is what she had to say earlier today on where the Trump transition is right now.
Soon, but he's just got action-packed days filled with meetings. I mean, these days are overscheduled with meetings. We have people flying in from all over the country, meeting with him to give their advice, their counsel, share their experiences, their vision for the country. Some of which will result in appointments to his administration, and some who just wish to be helpful. Very excited to have new leadership in the country and want to be part of that.
And gentlemen, to that end, today it was a cavalcade. That's right.
It's okay. I'm okay with that.
You got to run government like a business, right? That's been if you can. And casting a wide swath today, you saw a situation where Mr. Trump had in Tulsi Gabbard, the Democrat congresswoman from Hawaii, even had some media types like Wolf Blitzer and Charlie Rose show up.
And George Stephanopoulos, of all people, too.
Yeah, and there was Steffi showing up. And then also, of course, the guys we expected to see. You see Wolfie right there, about to go on the get on the elevators at Trump Plaza. But, of course, also Governors Rick Perry of Texas and Mary Fallon of Oklahoma.
Like Gayle King.
There's Gayle. There's all the gang you see on other places, but just keep it right here on Newsmax TV. Michael, your thoughts, looking out from California, remembering your dad's transition of the cavalcade of people we're seeing showing up at Trump Tower.
Well, I think it's good to see all this. And again, back to what I was saying about being an independent running as a Republican, I think that's what you're seeing in the group of people that keep on going in to meet Trump at the Trump Tower, and who he may appoint, who he may not appoint, and what have you. So I think it's really a good sign. And, you know, you've got to get it right. So let's not push the president-elect into making choices that may not be right for his administration and or the country. And I think one of those things he's got to really seriously think about is, I may be a friend and like Mitt Romney, but is that going to be a great fit for Donald Trump? Because they're basing on two sides of the coin when it comes to Russia. And the fact is that Mitt Romney was 100% right with everything he said when he was debating Barack Obama back in 2012.
And, of course, John, as Michael has made mention, that was this weekend out in New Jersey.
Right.
Both Romney and Rudy Giuliani show up. So it looks like we've got Rudy versus Romney for the State Department. Who's your money on, Bogman?
Well, I would say, and I agree with Michael, I think it's critically important on an issue like Russia that the Secretary of State and the President share the same worldview. And maybe Donald Trump wants to hear Mitt Romney out. I think it's encouraging for everyone to see the President-elect meeting with a diverse group of people, even someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who may have no chance of becoming a cabinet member. But it sends the right message to the country, and it sends the right message to our adversaries across the world that here is a man who won his election and may have had some political entanglements and battles with other people, but when it comes time to govern, you can come together and at least have a discussion about the future of the country.
Michael Reagan, last 30 seconds to you, sir. Advice you might have for the president-elect.
Get it right. I mean, that's my advice to the president-elect. Get it right from the start, and you will get a lot done in that first 100 days. You were a member of that Congress back in 1994. I was an honorary member of that Congress back in 1994 when you were sworn in. You got to get it right from the get-go. If you don't, you're downhill. Ask Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yep, those first 100 days for us in the Congress. Good advice, Michael Reagan. Thanks for joining us tonight from Southern California via telephone. Now, Brother Bogman, we'd ask you to stay right here. When we come back, perhaps a guy who is a prototypical Trump Democrat. Rock tough on the border, Michael Cutler. We'll talk about the border and more when we come back.
In